action shifts gears from national to state and city levels. 15-minute cities, a concept you never voted for. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Today I want to redo a show that I did with Tish Conlon about a month and a half ago and update it a little bit to address the fact that the United States government has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And now what's happened is climate action is shifting down to the state and city levels because there's quite a few die-hard climate activists at those levels, and they're convinced they want to change the world. They want to stop climate change. So I'll show you the material that I found here. I'll discuss some of the new science findings as well. And we'll have a look at how your neighborhood might be suddenly turning into a 15-minute city. And it's not clear that very many people have ever voted for that. Anyhow, we'll just zip through this. So before we get going too far, I want to let you know we have a new event coming up on March 11th. It's called Let's Nix Net Zero Together. It's an in-person book launch of Energy and Climate at a Glance, our little book, and a presentation by two of the authors, and it will be held in Calgary, Alberta. There is an optional live stream, and you can order tickets at Friends of Science on our website. So, Trump dumps Paris Agreement. So President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement and related climate agreements dating back to 1992. He called for a re-evaluation of the so-called endangerment finding on CO2, and he terminated the Green New Deal in the U.S., and his plan is drill, baby, drill. Just last year and the year before, the House Judiciary Committee under Chairman Jim Jordan was reviewing the fact that there's some kind of a climate cartel that's been established over the years, and they see the climate cartel as having declared war on the American way of life. The climate cartel is waging a global world war for net zero against disfavored American companies, including those in the fossil fuel, aviation, and farming industries that allow Americans to drive, fly, and eat. Yeah, well, if you're going to save the planet, do you have to eat? Anyway, so what's happened is this. There's another organization called America is All In. And this is a group of cities and a diverse number of organizations, and they're all in to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So they don't care that the United States as a country pulled out of Paris Agreement. They're going to try and do it themselves. So America is All In. It's made up of 5,000 leaders strong, local governments, higher education institutions, businesses, tribal nations, investors, healthcare organizations, faith groups, cultural institutions, and 10 states. Now, even before the inauguration of President Trump, the U.S. Climate Alliance vowed to advance climate action across America. So they knew it was coming, and they're like, okay, we filled the void left by the federal government before, and we'll do it again. And you might wonder, why would states and cities be so keen on this? And probably the answer is that their pension funds are invested in some kind of climate bond. This comes from our video, Red Flags All Over the Climate Movement. But I don't know that for sure. That's a guess. And carbon credits said that there would be resistance at home. The U.S. Climate Alliance, representing 24 states, pledges to cut emissions by 66% by 2035. And the American is All In coalition is chaired by former Biden administration officials, so it's kind of like they haven't left office yet. They're representing states that account for nearly 60% of the U.S. economy, so quite a powerful group. But let's see, can you really, cut emissions dramatically or not? I mean, here's the US in terms of annual CO2 emissions. They did reduce emissions quite dramatically, mostly because they converted a lot of their coal plants to natural gas. But meanwhile, China is just booming ahead with emissions. So whatever any of these countries do, including Canada, to reduce emissions, will just be scooped up and accelerated by China. So it's really a pointless task. There's some interesting news that's coming from the Environmental Protection Agency. Apparently, billions of dollars worth of gold bars that the Biden administration was throwing off the Titanic. So that will be interesting to see. But note that that money was going to nonprofits, states, tribes, and cities who are part of that coalition. So where did this all begin? Well, it actually began with Enron years ago, but this climate cult, shall we call it, really picked up and took off in 2006 when several of the country's wealthiest foundations hired a consulting firm to comprehensively survey the available scientific literature and to consult with more than 150 leading climate change and energy experts. So they came up with this plan here designed to win. And basically the plan is that they were going to fund environmental non-governmental organizations to be the front man for their plans to make it look like it was actually the public that wanted whatever things they were campaigning for, like EVs or wind and solar. And ultimately, the report predicted that the passage of cap-and-trade legislation would prompt a sea change that washes over the entire global economy. So they really wanted to set up a strong cap-and-trade policy in the United States and the European Union and a binding international agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. So this is like a big carbon trading market. So there's billions, probably trillions of dollars at stake in all of this. So they're not going to give up easily. But let's look at cities. What's your city up to on climate? Now, this here is an excerpt of the Exponential Roadmap. And in that report, which was issued in the fall of 2019, they say that if the Paris Agreement shows a clear vision of where we need to be, the carbon law, there is no law like that, of halving emissions, meaning cutting them in half, every decade sets the direction. Rather than putting a goal over the horizon, this places the immediate focus squarely on the next decade, where solutions to halve emissions already exist. I don't think there is a solution that will cut emissions in half, honestly. Cities, companies, and citizens have a critical role to drive momentum, to accelerate those solutions. So you should know that about the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015, so we're just coming up to the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, Yvo de Boer, who was the executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, said at the time, the only way that a 2015 agreement can achieve a 2-degree goal is to shut down the whole global economy. Now, actually, the Paris Agreement is voluntary. However, in Canada, we made the targets mandatory with Bill C-12, and frankly, cities have no mandate to address climate change. They're supposed to be serving local municipal issues and services. So, just imagine. Can you imagine your city's emissions being cut in half by 2030? Well, this is also from the Exponential Roadmap, and here's the rationale for going to cities to try and do climate action. And it's quite clearly stated here, cities occupy 3% of the world's landmass, but they're dense hotspots of activity, home to over half the world's population. They consume 2/3 of global energy, account for 70% of global CO2 emissions. These emissions are not evenly distributed. 18% of all global emissions come from just 100 cities. And so there are organizations called the C40 and the C100 cities. And then down here, many cities could have their emissions relatively easily by strengthening policies that aim to change the behavior of businesses and citizens and investing in appropriate infrastructure. The technology to have emissions is mature and ready to be deployed at scale to reach this target by 2030. So that's the deal with this logo, cutting the emissions in half by 2030, which is only 5 years away. So just to give you an inkling of how much work they've got in the background, if you go on the C40 Cities site, you'll see Paris, France. It tells you when they were a member, what the population is, the area in square kilometers, the GDP. Here's Toronto. And look at that. The former mayor of Toronto, David Miller, and climate activist Bill McGibbon put this book together, solved how the world's great cities are fixing the climate crisis. Well, there is no climate crisis, but these people want to fix it, and they think that cities are the place where this will happen. And it's important to notice that Arup, this consulting firm, wrote up this project called Deadline 2020 in 2016. And the C40 cities adopted a plan to ensure your personal carbon footprint would be small by 2020. So that's very interesting in light of the fact that Ivo de Boer called for a global economic shutdown. So in the report, they estimate that people today now have an average of 5.1 tons CO2 carbon footprint, a personal one, and they want it to be 2.9 tons CO2 by 2030, which is only 5 years away, and they want it to be zero by 2050. So Canadian personal carbon footprints range from about 14 to 17 tons CO2 equivalent. So, and certainly in the northern states of the United States, it would be about the same as Canada. So imagine how drastic that cut would be to your lifestyle. And again, the exponential roadmap was full of all these great ideas about how 97% of the traffic on the road doesn't need to be on the road, maybe only 3% needs to be on the road. And funnily enough, that's what happened during lockdowns. And the only organization in the world that was cheering on these empty, gutted, dystopian cities was the World Economic Forum, claiming that lockdowns are quietly improving cities around the world, while people were going bankrupt, committing suicide, losing their businesses, losing hope. But look at this. Pandemic data is driving the push for 15-minute cities. So this is post-COVID lockdowns. And Arup, once again, is telling us that urban planners have been producing 30-minute cities, but the 2020 pandemic challenged our underlying assumptions, and now we look at the 15-minute village. So now you're going to live in a village. So obviously the simplistic climate assumption is that if you cut all urban activity and movement in half, then you'll reach your climate targets. And likewise, urban dwellers can be more easily swayed or coerced to participate in behavior change, either through threats, such as the health pandemic issue, or incentives, like carbon perks. And the possibility is very real that you will be given a personal carbon ration, which will be on your Vaxport and digital wallet. So this peer-reviewed paper came out after the pandemic, and they were quite excited that the need for a low-carbon recovery from the COVID-19 crisis opened a new window of opportunity for personal carbon allowances, meaning a carbon ration. And they talk here about how wonderful it was that these mobile apps designed for COVID-19 infection tracking could be revised and used to track personal carbon allowances or rations. So, and they call this a unique natural experiment, the COVID crisis. So they want to use the lessons learned in the COVID pandemic to address climate crisis. Except there's no climate crisis. And curiously, the C40 cities came up with this collection of videos with kind of a nudge behavioral thing, telling us that before the recent lockdowns, we led hectic lives. Now, that seems to suggest that maybe those hectic lives were not fun or interesting. I mean, most of the people I know before the COVID lockdowns were very happy entrepreneurs. There are lots of people traveling here and there for work, for pleasure, for vacation. Lots of entrepreneurial ideas popping up. I know there was a very great little cafe on 17th Avenue that opened just a couple of weeks before the COVID lockdowns. So all these little restaurants, that always struggle on the edge anyway, and all of their servers, went through that crazy kind of roundabout merry-go-round of, yes, we can open, but you have to wear a mask, or you have to have an outdoor patio. Oh, we'll give you permission to have the patio. You build the patio, and then they say, oh, we have to lock down again. So, there was this ongoing cycle where people were losing their businesses and their minds, and they would have preferred to be in the hectic time before the pandemic. And I'm not really sure why a city is being a busybody about how you live your life. So now the C40 cities are suggesting that we should create a new normal and explaining what a 15-minute city is. Now, there are some aspects of the 15-minute city. It goes hand in hand with a smart city, and smart city applications often are very useful. For instance, like coordinating and synchronizing traffic lights. That's helpful. Traffic moves much better. There's much less road rage. Or having an app that tells you when your bus is coming, especially in Canada and the northern U.S., where you're not going to have to stand outside in the cold for half an hour to not miss your bus. You can stay home until right at the last minute and then run down to the bus stop. That's very helpful. But the problem is this kind of material can be gathered in a way that can be used improperly. Now, just before we get into that, just so you know, this is the fellow who thinks that you should just have a 3-ton CO2 personal carbon ration. And he thinks that if you need more, you just have to buy some climate credits from somebody. So how do you think that will work out? But actually, it turns out we don't need to do any of this. This is an article that's posted on the Clintel network. Clintel is an international network of about 2,000 scientists from around the world and scholars, and they all say there's no climate emergency, and they explain why. But in this article, which was by Steve Koonin, who was past President Obama's science advisor, and Mark Mills, an energy expert, they explain that the Paris Accords are seen as kind of climate insurance, but they're actually unaffordable and unnecessary. So we're often told that if we take climate action, then the bad things won't happen. Like there'll be fewer wildfires or fewer hurricanes. And of course, all these natural disasters are terrifying to people and horrible for the people who are caught within them, because their lives are turned upside down and sometimes ruined completely. But, making people pay a carbon tax is not going to make extreme weather go away. So they're actually lying to you when they put that kind of proposition forward, because extreme weather is integral to climate. We've got a couple of presentations on our website, one by Dr. Madhav Kandekar, where he explains why and how extreme weather is something that just happens. It always will happen, and doesn't matter how high your carbon tax is, it won't make it go away. So in this article, the other thing that they mention is that even the 2 degree C limit is not a hard limit. When Hans Schellenhuber, the so-called father of the 2 degree limit, was once asked why he gave that number, he responded that it was about right, and it was an easy number for politicians to remember. So there's no credible case to make that all manner of chaos will suddenly break out if the temperature rises 2 or even 3 degrees. So that's just ludicrous. So anyhow, let's have a quick overview. Climate change is a handy rationale. 15-minute cities. The climate change is the rationale, and in fact the alleged climate emergency is based on outdated science and the misuse of a scenario called RCP 8.5, which I'll discuss later. It's quite true that urban planners generally hate cars. They hate parking for cars, roads, and your messy freedoms. And all climate activists would love to have a good war, as Seth calls it, a wartime command economy and rationing. That's their dream. And in the United States, Ezra Silk, who was formerly with Greenpeace, came up with this abomination, which mocks the wartime effort of so many brave soldiers. Now, you may have heard of Sidewalk Labs. They were going to build a smart city in Toronto. And it was suddenly abandoned in May of 2020. And I really recommend that people read Josh O'Kane's book. It gives you amazing insight into what was going on. But Sidewalk Labs tried for years to get this project off the ground, and then they abruptly canceled it in May of 2020. And why is that? Because that's when lockdowns hit. Why couldn't they get the project through? Well, Sidewalk Smart City had big privacy issues. So there were many, many risks associated with being able to monitor and calculate all of the resident emissions of the people who would live in Sidewalk Labs Smart City. So one of them was surveillance from both the state and surveillance capitalism, collection without valid consent, excessive collection of personal data. Data breaches might happen, and then all of this information about every person would be out there in the big cyberspace. Data monetization. Somebody might capitalize on private information about you. And lack of anonymity for differently abled persons. So, of course, if you have a building that has, let's say, if you have a building that has 1,000 residents, and let's say one of them is in a wheelchair, then that person would use the elevator in a different way than other people. They would use different resources within the building than other people. And so even though the data might be anonymized about them, it would be able to be reverse engineered. You could identify, oh, that's that person. Or say someone who has diabetes, they'd be throwing out a certain number of injections and such like, needles. So the garbage could tell the story of someone. I know this sounds crazy, but when you think about it, you realize, yes, these are privacy and personal security risks. Another aspect would be loss of data sovereignty. So it's even though smart cities have some benefits, ultimately it's very risky, and they could never get by the privacy acts, the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, and the federal government. But amazingly, once we locked down, as we know, there were a number of projects of even the Canadian military was doing surveillance, electronic surveillance during lockdowns. Now, plans were floated for an Emergency Measures Act for climate change, and this was from September of 2021, and that was prior to the Freedom Convoy, which went to Ottawa in early 2022. But in this plan, they suggest that the pandemic has brought about upheavals in the application of rights and freedoms, and restrictions such as curfew, telework, border closures, travel have appeared, and this derogated in part from the Canadian and Quebec Charters of Rights with the aim of defeating COVID-19 threat. So this climate activist academic says the pandemic has demonstrated that we can take rapid and radical measures. So they want to apply emergency measures related to the fight against COVID, which could then apply to the fight against climate change. But here's some insights from our president at Friends of Science, Ron Davison, who's a professional engineer. And his view is that Canadians are going to end up spending trillions to not save billions. And Calgary and Ottawa both have enormous climate plans. Calgary's 87 billion, Ottawa is something like 65 billion. And they'll spend the alleged climate GDP. So Ron writes that even the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has acknowledged that future climate change will have a negligible impact on GDP growth. Now, that's not what all these experts are telling us all the time, right? They're like, oh, it'll be catastrophic. It'll cost us a fortune. But these experts, not the media pundits and not people like Mark Carney, these experts say it will have a negligible impact on GDP growth. And in Canada, the Parliamentary Bureau Officer also looked at what Canada's GDP would look like with full Paris Accord compliance. Well, with full Paris Accord compliance, Canada's GDP would still be 5.8% below the do-nothing case, meaning that if we did nothing, our GDP might be less by 5.8%. So Ron summarizes it by saying, for the trillions of dollars Canada will spend fighting climate change, we will improve our GDP prospects by maybe 17 billion or 0.8%. So it's a worthless effort, pure virtue signaling. And frankly, cities will never reach net zero. And there's no need to, because carbon dioxide is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate. But nonetheless, here we go. We have Mayor Don Iveson, former mayor of the city of Edmonton, riding his bike to work in the middle of winter. Happy International Winter Bike to Work Day. Well, you know what? You go ahead. Just don't make me do it. Lots of people love the challenge. I'm not one of them. And I know that millions of other people are like me. Now, here's a curious thing. Back in 1988, James Hansen told us that there was a temperature rise and global warming had begun, human-caused global warming had begun. At that point, he identified the temperature as being, the global average temperature as being 59 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. But look what happened over time. The temperature dropped. And this was the World Meteorological Organization in 2020 saying that it was 14.9 degrees Celsius or 58.8. Now, we did have a little bump this past year that was probably caused by Hunga-Tonga and all of the water vapor. But the point is, we're not seeing significant warming. Now, here's another thing. You've probably seen these stripes somewhere. You maybe have seen the cover of Greta's book. And, you know, when you see these stripes, you go, oh my, yes, it was cooler before. This is representative of temperatures. It was cooler before, and now look how hot it's getting. So that does look very terrifying, doesn't it? But it doesn't look very terrifying when you see a broader context. So this goes from 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, to the present. And you can see that climate change is cyclical. It's not you, and it's not CO2. Now, I'd mentioned before this RCP 8.5. Now, these scenarios were designed for research only, but RCP 8.5 became the source of the climate emergency when banks and financial institutes and many researchers mistakenly adopted it as if it was a business as usual case. So that does look kind of spooky, doesn't it? To the ordinary person, this looks quite catastrophic. But when you take it away, you see that really there's no climate emergency. Unfortunately, now banks, financial institutions, the federal government, and climate data centers claim RCP 8.5 is the business as usual case, even though it's not. And why do I say it's not? Well, it's an implausible case. It's a case that was strictly designed for research. So, kind of like baking a cake, they, added in an extraordinary amount of a few ingredients to see what the simulation would show in terms of warming. So one thing they added was lots of people. The UN predicts the world population would be about 9 billion by 2100, while RCP 8.5 thought it could be 12 to 15 billion. So they added 3 to 6 billion more people than are demographically possible to exist by that time. Under RCP 8.5, world crude production in 2100 would have to be about 4 times that of 2015. That's impossible to do. And lots of academic papers ponder whether or not there's enough coal in the world, because it seems to burn more coal than exists on the planet in order to get that scenario. So we have a report on this if you want to read more about why these RCP scenarios are skewing markets and making people fear an apocalyptic end. So getting to net zero means poverty and degrowth, pretty much for everyone. We've done quite a thorough analysis. One of our directors, Ian Cameron, did this analysis. It's on our blog. And you can see how impossible this is. This little bump here, where there's a drop, that was the COVID lockdown. But you can see that it's almost inconsequential. And you can remember how inconvenient and horrible those lockdowns were. So to imagine that measures would be imposed to try and meet this kind of drop, they would be horrific. They would make life terrible for everyone. And here's Canada's greenhouse gas emissions objectives and targets. So this is the interim objective for 2026. That's not going to happen. And the target for 2030, well, can you imagine how horrible life would be? So Robert Lyman did this report on 15-minute cities, a good or a bad idea. And you might want to have a look at it. It's also on our blog. He calls the 15-minute city equals a dead end. In Canada, as a whole, of the 15 million commuters in 2023, 83% traveled by car, truck, or van, 10% traveled by transit, and 6% by active transportation, meaning cycling or walking. And commuting levels on transit have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. We also have this comment from Edward Glaser of Harvard University, and he characterized the concept of 15-minute city as a dead end, which would stop cities from fulfilling their true role as engines of opportunity. So it doesn't sound like it's going to be good if these states and cities go ahead with their climate alliance. But before anyone jumps on a bandwagon, maybe it would be a good idea to look at the climate science that the Trump administration is relying on. So there's a number of new climate science papers on this website of the Heritage Foundation. You might want to have a look at them. And, there are some new insights on climate science that are changing the narrative quite radically. So just a reminder that America is all in, is still going to try and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. As I've shown you, these will be installing onerous regulations and behavioral nudges on every person in states and especially in cities. We have more on cities and green climate activism and sort of the money flow behind it in their municipal pension plans and such like. So you might want to have a look at that. It's on our YouTube channel. And just a reminder again, let's nix net zero together. So we are doing this in-person book launch of Energy and Climate at a Glance. There will be presentation by 2 of the authors. It will be in Calgary, Alberta. There is an optional live stream, and you can find out more information and order tickets at our Friends of Science website. Now, another thing, if you can't make it to that, or you don't want to sit through a live stream or even a recorded version, you can just buy the book. So you can also go online and buy the book from us, $15 Canadian, plus shipping. There's a bit of a deal if you get more than one. And it's just a really straightforward, plain language, very simple, but dealing with complex issues, facts on the 22 prominent climate topics. So they're things that people really often see in the press, and they kind of go, I don't know, does that make sense? I wish I knew. I wish I had something I could refer to. Well, this is it, and it's also ideal, I think, for schools, because what we have is a whole generation of children and young people who are depressed and fearful of the end of the world, all because of the climate cult and the climate cartel. And I think we need to give them some hope and calm them down and give them some information that's quite easy to access and very easy to understand. So I hope that you will look into getting that book. Please join us online if you're not in the Calgary or Alberta area. And if you can come to our event, it should be fun. There'll be light refreshments, coffee, tea, such like. And it'll be at the Best Western Village Park in Calgary. It's across from McMahon Stadium. There's free parking on site, or you could take the LRT. So it's March 11th, 2025 at 7 p.m. So hope to see you there. Thanks very much for listening to this video explainer. Thank you for supporting Friends of Science. Please share, subscribe, and if you like, you could become a member of Friends of Science. More information on our website. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.